Sam. So thank you so much, Matthias, for those really wonderful and careful and really helpful comments. So I don't think I can, I'm not sure that I can respond to all of them, but maybe let me just have a go at perhaps clarifying some of the points that you raised. So it may well be that the terminology of sovereignty that I'm employing here is obscuring more than it's illuminating and is not particularly helpful. I'll take that point on board. So certainly, and so a lot of the questions and queries that you raise, I think, are very, very understandable given my use of that terminology. Let me just say clarify at the outset at least what I kind of take myself to be implying here. So the first thing is that I view these kind of human sovereign rights, as I'm calling them, as things that belong to individual persons, not to states, communities, collectivities, and so forth. So they're possessed by human persons in respect of the political relations that they have with others. Now, another good question that you raise is, well, what do you mean by politics? And it's a really fair question. So what I mean by politics here is actually something very, very thin and very broad, right? So what I simply mean is simply the ability of human beings, of persons, to decide things together with other persons, things of mutual importance, right? And that could be, a constitutional arrangement within a state, or it could be, you and I engaging in a private. So, and the big kind of meta claim that I'm making is that a basic constraint on these political interactions that we have, very, very kind of broadly conceived, is that to be minimally just, they have to exclude violence as an input to those processes, right? So that's kind of roughly how I'm. And then this, second set of questions that you raised, how am I understanding war? You're right, this is a very revisionary understanding of war. It's a much more normatively rich understanding. It's explicitly moralized understanding of war. And you're right, it's going to give very different conclusions, very different demarcations in a lot of the cases that you mentioned, new wars and so forth. I'm actually very happy with that. I think that defensive wars as well, I'm going to end up saying that to the extent that uses of force are defensive, they're probably not warfare in the sense that I'm understanding it, right? It's not the employment of mass violence to change political structures. So that's the whole point, in a way, to kind of drive in that normative wedge. So just kind of given all of that, just really quickly, maybe I'll just pick up on a couple of points. So one of the things that you said a couple of times, I think this is linked in, was, so you're raising the question about, you want to make room for a conception of legitimate revolution. So one of the things that you say a number of times is that a revolution, or in another context, an intervention, need not violate the sovereign rights of the government. But I hope that from what I just said now, to make it clear that I completely agree with that, right? So the claim is not that when we engage in violent politics or a political intervention in cases of mass atrocity, that we're violating the rights or the normative claims of the government or the state. Right? They don't have any. They're lost. The conditionality argument is right about that. What I'm trying to point attention to is that even if that's the case, there can be important rights that just everybody within that community possesses to do things their own way, and to do that, to forge those political settlements in a way that is not affected by violence, either by insiders and outsiders. And you're absolutely right to say that I don't want to draw any distinction between insiders and outsiders, and that's another way that I think I depart quite significantly from the traditional conceptions of sovereignty, and you're right to say that. Let me just very quickly and finally finish off by saying, just on the point of whether we ought to make room for a conception of legitimate revolution or legitimate intervention that is genuinely premised on political violence. So what I want to say about that, I think, is sure, we can, right? We can, but we probably are going to have to acknowledge, on my view at least, that a revolution or a politicized violent intervention could be justified only in the sense that it is a justifiable infringement of these rights, right? So I'm not ruling out the possibility that there may be cases where the situation is so awful, right? The abuses are so horrendous that the only way to do that is by engaging in violent political processes, right? You can't rule that out. But what I'm saying is that even in situations where they may be justified, we have to acknowledge that that's justified because they're justified infringements of rights, and that is going to have consequences. And in particular, what I want to make room for, what I want to establish is that acknowledging that conception can lead us to have a better approach to actually doing these interventions in practice, and I do believe that actually was the case in Libya. I'm not convinced that is actually the case today in Syria, given where things have got to. I'm not sure that the kind of strategy that I was laying out in this paper would have any hope in the situation in Syria as it is today. And now what I think that just means is that there can be there can be windows that can be lost, and once those windows are closed, certain opportunities for certain kinds of morally permissible actions simply disappear, and then we may well be in a kind of tragic case where we morally have to do something that violates these rights in an important way. But let me leave it there and open the questions. All right, so if I want to have any special methodology here, maybe I'll just sweep from one side of the room to the other.
Let's again try to find the people who haven't had it.
Oh, okay, all right, so let me just make a... just keep your hands up. Yeah, so do why don't you start, Danny? Yeah.
So I'm kind of wondering, what are we on the hook for, or what can we do as the interveners? So it seems like you talk about how it's pretty clear that a just political space or just political process can't have violence, so that's out of the picture. So when we intervene, we stop the violence and we let nonviolent processes take over. So I'm wondering, is it pretty much just a lack of violence, or are there more things that go into a just political process other than a lack of violence? Because if it's just a lack of violence, then it seems like there's nothing to stop us from saying, well, now that we've set up this nonviolent space, let's sort of tilt the thing one way or another. We would like a different regime to come out of this, so let's give some money to some people or something. And it's still a just process because we stop the violence. And that kind of sounds not so great. So maybe it's a just process includes more than just nonviolence. Maybe there's, I don't know, some sort of equal space or something. But then what are we on the hook for as interveners? What do we have to set up aside from just a nonviolent space? Do we have to balance out different parties or something with resources? Or it seems like either way, I'm not sure about the consequences.
Right, so thanks. So obviously it's not just being nonviolent, right? So that's why I said in the paper that it's a minimal constraint on a just political process that it be nonviolent. The reason I focus on it is I think it's a profoundly important one, right? So that when politics is involved in a political process, when violence is involved in the political process, it contaminates it, it corrupts it in a really profound way, in a way that almost nothing else that you can imagine kind of does. Inequalities, inappropriate, coercive, all these kinds of things. Violence really is a very profound disruption. But obviously, a full account of just political relations has to be infinitely richer than that, and it's going to end up to be, very, very broad spectrum. So, my claim, I guess, is simply that, in a situation of intervention where your means are intrinsically violent, and where the intervention is premised on the fact that violence is occurring within a community, then the termination of that violence and the, as I put it, the creation of a space where, at the very minimum, a process that is not violent can take place. It might be flawed in all kinds of other ways, but at the very minimum, it's going to be nonviolent. That seems like a good strategic objective, and at least it can, yeah. Slide there? Yeah.
My question was actually very similar to Danny's. I was going to ask why the focus on violence specifically. It seems that there would be a constraint against imposing any kind of debilitating harm that undermines human sovereignty, which would include, which might include, for example, sanctions, economic sanctions. and I can't decide whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. On the one hand, it's a good thing not to have politically motivated sanctions because sanctions can be very, very harmful to the general population. But on the other hand, it eliminates what might sometimes be a useful tool. So, like Danny, I was wondering, what are we on the hook for? What are the options that are on the table, given your account, and where sanctions would fall? And
Right.
it seems to me that I'm guessing the answer is yes, that we can't include sanctions with
Well, right. So the way that I think about this is that there's a continuum. So if you think, if you're kind of motivated by the kinds of thoughts that I started with, right, that we're motivated by what I call the enlightenment of conception of the human subject. This this desire to, this thought that there's a requirement to recognize the status that we have as free, rational, and equal agents. Then you might think of these things as falling on a continuum, right? So at the very extreme of the continuum, I want to put actions that simply eliminate the other, right, entirely, right? I kill you, right? Which is, or in the political context, that's why genocide is right down at the end, right? So it's not even, it's just an attempt to entirely eliminate, negate the other as an agent. One step back from that, you might think about, cases that Victor was talking about this morning, cases of violent duress. Now, what's distinctive about that is that it interacts with the other, engages with the other in a minimal sense as an agent, right? In one sense, you have a choice, right? You can decide either to kill or not, or to be killed yourself. So it's kind of acknowledging you as an agent in that very minimal sense, but it's very close to killing you. It's very close to actual violence in the sense that it constrains your agency to such an extent that it seems very, very close to that. Now, sanctions, I think I would probably put a step or so along, further down the continuum than that, right? It's, and it's going to matter a lot what kind of sanctions they are, who they're targeted against, what the basis of liability is, what the harm is to third parties. All of that's going to matter a huge amount. But certain kinds of sanctions, for example, may be very close to violent coercion in that sense, that they improperly and so radically diminish your options as an agent that they look very, very close to violent coercion. So that's the way that I'm going to think about it, I think. David.
I would like to bring this back to the earlier discussion we had of Helen's paper and the disagreement between you and Helen. And it doesn't seem to me that there's a contradiction, but it does seem to me that there's a kind of a tension between what we were talking about earlier and what you were talking about in this paper. Because in this paper, political self-determination gets celebrated as a kind of expression of human sovereignty. But when we were talking about conditional aggression, political self-determination didn't really seem important enough in order to justify violent resistance. And so, I can see a way in which you could make those two positions compatible, but it seems to me that there is a way in which that you seem to be both downplaying at one point and kind of celebrating at another point. I'm just wondering how the two things are related.
Right. So, so it's not a coincidence that these are in two papers rather than in. So look, there is clearly there's a tension there, right? So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that my position, it has to live within a narrow band, right, that exists between. So it places these kinds of political self-determination rights as being significant enough to constrain and rule out certain kinds of intervention, right? Certain kinds of manifestly political interventions, we might call them. But at the same time, they have to be not stringent enough to justify defense against, violent defense against agents who are seeking solely to impact on those rights rather than, broader, rights to life or, rights to, more substantive rights to liberty. Now, so that, what that means is that there's basically a band that, and it may well be that that band is vanishingly small or actually doesn't exist, that those two thresholds cross each other and therefore the position just collapses. But my position has to be that there is in fact a space between those two thresholds, and that's the space in which this idea of human sovereignty lives and has its function. Victor.
So I enjoyed the paper. So I agree that you've picked out something that's valuable, but I just wonder why you think it's as valuable as you think it is. So think about the violence thing. Imagine that there were two things we could do in intervening in Libya. One thing we could do was shoot Gaddafi and his cronies and then set up just institutions where we get all sorts of different parties to participate, and they have a very high chance of setting up circumstances of justice. We get better equality, better human rights protections, and so on. Or we could protect this space where there's these protesters. And the protesters will set up institutions that are a lot less just. They'll involve a lot fewer people in participation in democratic institutions, and they will have much more substantively unjust results. They'll discriminate against people and so on. They won't be really terrible, but they'll be a lot worse. I just don't see why it should necessarily be true that we shouldn't take the first option and just shoot Gaddafi and his cronies. And it's true that when we set up these institutions, it'll be done through a bit of violence, but they're liable to be killed, so...
Right, so that's,
it's not like our just institutions are kind of profoundly
yeah. Right,
undermined
but that's
by
not
that.
the violence that I'm going to be worried about, right? So I'm actually quite sympathetic to the idea that Gaddafi and his cronies might have been liable to be killed, kind of on the model of the Barack Obama example that I gave, right? I mean, if it's true that he's the commander-in-chief and he is directly responsible, and that's the most effective way of doing it, then it seems to me that he's personally liable on defense, on straight-out defensive grounds. Now, I think the ambiguity in your question, and the real, as you say, we kill Gaddafi and set up just institutions in Libya.
We do it in order to do
how
that.
exactly? How do we do that? The violence that's necessary for achieving that is a violence that I'm going to be worried about.
So we do it in order
right?
to do that. So we kill Gaddafi
Yeah.
because we want to set up these just institutions.
But how do we?
Yeah, suppose we're good at that. So we're really good at getting people to participate, and they'll trust us and so on. I mean, obviously, like in the real world, none of this stuff's going to be true. But you want this
but
deep
that's-
moral
but that's
principle
all-
that shows that
yeah.
violence is sort of necessarily...
No, but so again, I mean, the distinction that I'm making is it's a very, it's not always an easy one to draw, but I think it draws it in the right way in that case. So I mean, I indeed think that it could be permissible to target Gaddafi in that case. If that were, I mean, if he's responsible for these ongoing attacks on civilians, killing him is effective, it's necessary, it's proportionate, all of that, then I think that we can kill him. My worry is about using forceful methods to determine a political settlement. So I take it that just killing Gaddafi, it doesn't do that at all. I mean, that puts you pretty much in the situation that I was imagining happening after you protect the space and the protesters overthrow. Right? Then you need to go to real. Then you have the political work of how you actually determine what the arrangements are going to be. So what your example would have to be would be one where much more like an Iraq type situation, right? You go and you decapitate the government. And you basically plonk your forces in the country. I mean, because I can't imagine any other way that you could do what you're suggesting. And you forcibly impose certain constitutional mechanisms on that state. Now, my response to that, I think, and you might say, and those arrangements are going to be better than any other arrangements that that the local guys could have come up with themselves. Now, that may be true. But what I want to say is that in doing that, we've violated something important, right? We've violated the right that people have to conduct these kinds of negotiations in a way that is at least minimally just in terms of that process. And I think that on my view, that means that it can't be done through a process of violence. And
Well, I mean, I agree that...
Let's give you can continue the conversation non-violently.
Larry.
Yeah, thanks, David. I agree with a lot of what you say. I'm struggling with a couple of things. One is exactly how you differ from the way in which I think R2P was meant to be understood to begin with, and then how you're going to deal with some of these cases that I think have made it difficult for R2P anyway. So let me, these are related issues. I'll try to be very brief. So as I read the document, documents that formed R2P. It was meant, for the first prong anyway, that you're focusing on about possible humanitarian intervention. It was meant as a last resort. So you've already conceded that, right, in your remarks to Matthias. So that's fine. So it looks like you're not making a significant change, at least as the way in which R2P is often understood. But then I guess the problem becomes, and this is related, I think, to what Victor was asking about. So what happens if you've got two groups that are both struggling for control of a single territory, and the territory really will only sustain one state because of the limited natural resources and a whole bunch of other things. So your view looks like we shouldn't take sides, the international community. But I take it if they're engaged in violent struggle, then you can separate them and try to keep them from continuing to fight with each other. But then, of course, the question is for how long? And do we have a protectorate that lasts for decades? Is that the kind of model you have in mind? And then related again is, you seem to think that as soon as you create a space for folks to protest, then that's going to lead to them actually being able to take over. But it's not clear to me that that's the case, even in the examples that you're working with, Libya and Syria. It may very well be that the government is just much too strong for that. It's not going to fall just because you've given the protesters kind of space. And again, then the question is, how much force can be used against the government, and at what point licensing a fairly significant regime that's going to use lethal force against a government that the international community judges to be illegitimate, but where indeed it may be supported by a significant group within the state.
Yeah, so look, these are all really difficult questions, and it may well be that these conceptions are not going to give you the answers to all of them. But in the protectorate case, yeah, I mean the image is very, you certainly have the right to, as I put it, push to the perimeter, push to the periphery, the violent actors, to create that space. For how long? I mean, I would say, for as long as the threat is present, for as long as it's imminent. Now it may well be that in a full conception, what you need is kind of further capacity building and support building operations to, support the local populations in negotiations towards a constitutional order, whatever that may be, and and then we can think about all kinds of things that might be within that account, but.
So Matthias raised the issue about secession, right? And so it may be that at a certain point you just think, well, we're going to divide it. But in the example that I gave, it's not really possible to divide that state because it simply won't sustain two self-sufficient bodies. You're not going to be able to divide it that way. So then, is it a permanent? So you've got these folks who are going to be at odds for the foreseeable future. So you would agree. So you're opposed to normal, in some ways, violent intervention that would end it sort of once and for all. But it looks like you're going to be then in favor of maybe smaller scale violence, but that will last for such a long time that it's not clear that it's a better.
Right, possibly, and then it may well be that one reflexive test you have to apply then is how does it actually do on these very objectives that we're talking about, right? And it may well be that a sustained operation like that kind of, as it were, ossifies a political struggle within a community is actually going to erode and degrade the very processes that you're trying to, that may well be the case. I'm not sure what to say about that. Azim, Sorry, Azim there,
Thanks, David. So David, there are several kind of moving parts to your paper, and I'm still kind of struggling to put them all together in my mind. So, at various points, your position seems to be that we should never choose sides in civil conflicts, but that seems hard to square with the way you start, because I would have thought that if it was a one-sided atrocity, just the government committing genocide against the population, that we could use military means to overthrow that government if that was the only way to stop that atrocity. In which case, it's a little hard to see, even if that would have an effect on the post-bellum political arrangement. In which case, it's a little hard to see why, if the other party to the armed conflict is also trying to prevent atrocities, why we couldn't just help them also, even though that would affect the political dispensation afterwards. So that makes me think that maybe you're really only concerned with civil conflicts in which ultimately only political goods are at stake. And that would make sense given your other views, because you don't think political goods are worth killing over. But this raises an issue, and I'm really not trying to come up with a clever reductio. I'm really just trying to think through the implications of your view, because it seems like if the non-state group does not have a just cause to wage war or armed conflict for the sake of political goods, then it seems like they're liable to attack too, which makes it seem like, again, if there's no atrocity issue, it's just political goods, and if the strategy you suggest would, as Larry pointed out, draw out the conflict, make it longer, make it bloodier, many, many more people would die, all for the sake of political goods, which aren't worth killing over. It does make it sound like maybe we should help the government annihilate the opposition. And maybe that is an implication of your view, and maybe it isn't, but I'm just trying to figure out how these different elements fit together. Political goods aren't worth killing over, all of these different things. It's hard for me to fit together.
Yeah, no, good. So, again, I think one thing that I'm going to have to say is that although these political rights are important, they're not always going to be overriding, right? And so that's going to be both the case negatively in the account that I'm going to want to give of self-defense, where I'm going to say that, although an aggressor is violating something really important by removing these political goods, that might not be sufficient to generate a right to kill in self-defense. And so, the converse of that, or the corollary in a way, might well be that in situations where the only way that you can prevent, a terrible atrocity, or in another context, a never-ending low-grade civil war that's just going to go on and on forever, is actually to engage in a political intervention that violates those rights, then equally, it may well be that there is an all things considered reason to do that. But what I'm going to want to insist on is that there is something that's lost when we do that, right? And it's important to account for that. And to come back to Larry's question or point about the genesis of R2P, that's not well accounted for in current conceptions of R2P, right? I don't see it there. In the basic way that the debate was set up and the way that it kind of eventually ended up being resolved, that sense of the importance of respecting the political autonomy of the community, once we acknowledge that the state and the representatives don't possess it anymore, doesn't fit anywhere well. And this is an attempt to try and situate that and to fit that. But again, it doesn't mean that it's always going to be the overriding consideration and it's always going to push you one way or another. I think my best account is that it's going to be one consideration amongst these others, an important one, and it's going to play a role in navigating these really complex questions. It's not going to determine it in its own.
So I think we've run out of time at this point. Let's just thank our So we can take a 15-minute break.